Hello, Pillow Pals. Welcome to the Pillow Time Historian. They were compelled to clean their intimate areas with strong alcohol, dry themselves with rough cloths, and then immediately attend to another man. Each day, the odor of dried blood, semen, and sweat accumulated, and no one permitted them to pause for a bath. If they were in pain, they remained silent. If they were dirty, they endured it because the customers continued to come. In medieval brothels, hygiene was not a priority for them, but was maintained solely to retain regular customers. There were no mirrors or clean water. No one inquired if they were okay. Tonight, we revealed the harsh and silent hygiene routines that medieval prostitutes had to endure. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I do here. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background noise, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone thinks walking past a stable is unpleasant, they've probably never stepped into a brothel in medieval Europe. The door didn't creak open into some lively place, as the stories say. It opened into heat and stench. That smell didn't drift. It came straight at you, full and lingering. It was the first thing the girls encountered before a bed, before a face, before a word. It was the thick, sour stink of old sweat. Wine that had soaked into the cloth. Blood that had dried in the corners. And something deeper that didn't have a name. Some turned pale right away. A few threw up into their sleeves. No one helped. The others just looked over for a second, then looked away. That was enough. Everyone had done it. Everyone had moved on. The floor was stone, but you wouldn't always see it. Layers of dirt, straw, and stains covered it. The color changed from place to place. You learned to step around the dark spots, not because you knew what they were, but because you didn't want to know. The walls were smoked black. Lamps burned tallow. The smoke added another layer to the air. You couldn't clean it. You just lived in it. The new girl got a dress. Someone handed it to her without saying anything. It was never clean. The fabric stuck to itself when folded. It had old sweat in the seams and sometimes blood at the hem. It smelled like the others. That was the point. Underwear wasn't included. Some tied a rag if they had one. Most didn't. Feet stayed bare. Shoes wore out too fast, and no one gave you more. There was a basin in the corner, wide, shallow, and always full of someone else's water. That was for washing, not for bathing. Washing meant wetting the cloth, rubbing a few places and being done. Face, armpits, and between the legs. Same rag, same water all day. It didn't make you clean. It just took off the worst layer. Sometimes there was wine or vinegar nearby. That helped with the smell. You dabbed some under the arms, maybe the thighs. It stung if you had scratches, which you probably did. It's strange to think that burning your skin a little was still considered better than smelling like what you actually lived in. Beds weren't real beds, just straw on the ground, maybe with a cloth sack over it. If there was a blanket, it was shared. If there was a pillow, it was someone's folded dress. The straw was always damp near the bottom. Lice came fast. Fleas were already there. The smell never left. Some girls lit dried herbs and waved them over the straw. It helped for an hour. Then it was back. There were no mirrors, no windows, one candle for 10 girls. When it burned low, that was the night. The heat didn't come from fire. It came from the bodies. 10 or 12 in one room, breathing, sweating, coughing. No one talked after lying down. Just a few groans, scratching, the creak of someone turning over, the slap of a foot on stone when someone stepped away to use the bucket. The bucket sat behind a curtain, if there was one. It was full by morning. Emptied when someone remembered. If it tipped, it stayed tipped for a while. No one cleaned the floor, just avoided that corner. The smell built up. By the third day, the new girl didn't flinch anymore. Meals were bread, wine and stew. If it was payday, fingers only. Rags weren't changed between wiping and eating. She might still be using the same cloth to wipe her legs that she used yesterday. No one noticed. No one mentioned it. There was always more important work waiting. Her hair was a mess by the second night. No brush, no oil. She tied it back with a string or tore a strip from the edge of the blanket. If lice came, and they did, she might shave her head. Others just rubbed ash into the scalp. It helped a little, but not for long. Water wasn't for hair. It was for wiping. There was never enough. The mouth was worse. No one had anything for teeth. Some chewed on mint leaves or pine twigs. Most didn't. Lips cracked. Gums bled. Some rubbed salt. Some did nothing. Breath smelled of hunger and wine and bad meat. If someone walked in today with that breath, they'd get kicked out of a cafe. Back then, it meant you still had your teeth. Periods didn't stop the work. Girls bled into rags, folded and reused, washed when they could, often not. The smell was stronger then, but no one said a word. You worked or you were replaced. If the cloth slipped, you reached down and fixed it. If it stained the straw, you turned it over. Hands stayed cracked. Feet were raw. Knees bruised. Fingernails bent backward. Cuts from combs or from men's buckles didn't get bandaged. They just dried out. If infection came, it came. If it didn't, you were lucky. The shock faded in days. The smell became the air. The rags became part of you. You folded the same dress every night knowing it was still damp. You shared the same basin knowing it would never be emptied. You slept in a corner that smelled like someone else. You didn't talk much, not because you were scared, but because there was nothing left to say. What struck me most is not that they got used to it, but how quickly they stopped noticing. After a week, no one could tell who was new. The smell evened out. The dress blended in. The hair looked the same. You moved more slowly. Not from age, but from weight. Not body weight, just the weight of the room, the air, the filth, the habit. No one told them to adapt. They just did it because they had to. Next, we'll look at how these women were taught to stay clean only for the men, and how even that kind of cleaning came with pain. Nobody explained why. They just showed her where to stand, what to use, and what not to forget. A cloth in one hand, a jar in the other. There was no mirror, just the back of a metal bowl bent out of shape. She leaned forward and wiped as they told her. First the front, then between the legs, then again, just to be sure. That was what mattered, being sure, or at least smelling like it. The jar held a thick liquid made from fat and herbs. It didn't clean anything. It sat on the skin, covered whatever was underneath. The smell was strong. It helped if the girl had been working for hours, helped cover what no amount of water could reach. She dipped 2 fingers, rubbed fast and put the lid back on. That jar was shared. Everyone used it. Sometimes it had hair stuck inside, sometimes dirt. She didn't look too close. Someone handed her a twig. She was told to chew it. That was for the mouth. There was no brushing, no rinsing. The twig had a bitter taste. If she chewed long enough, the end frayed. That was what she used to rub her teeth. It didn't help much. Her breath still smelled like whatever she had eaten or whatever had been near her face the night before. If breath mints had existed, they would have been worth more than gold in that place. They told her to smile sometimes, not always. Only when the man liked it. That meant she needed lips without scabs and teeth that weren't brown. If she had sores, she was told to bite her lip to hide them. If her teeth were loose, she didn't open her mouth wide. That was enough. Looking clean was more important than being clean. Hair was next. They showed her how to tie it back. Not for comfort, for access, for looks. It had to be off the neck, behind the ears, not tangled, but not perfect. Some rubbed oil to make it shine. Most didn't have oil. They used their sweat or rubbed fat from the food bowl. A few added dried flowers. It made them sneeze, but it looked nice. She didn't have time to wash it. No one did. The water was cold. Drying took too long. Wet hair got you sick. Sick girls didn't work. Sick girls were replaced. So she tied it up with twine and moved on. Under her arms, they told her to rub vinegar. If there was no vinegar, then wine. If there was no wine, then a damp cloth. Anything to take away the smell. It didn't work, but she did it anyway. Habit formed quickly in that room. It wasn't about the result. It was about showing you tried. There was a small cloth for wiping after each client. It hung near her bed. She rinsed it when she could, dried it by the fire if she was lucky. Most of the time it stayed damp. She used it anyway, rubbing fast, then hiding it under the blanket again. If someone else took it, she used her sleeve. If her sleeve was wet, she waited until morning. They said nothing about her comfort, only what men noticed. Men didn't like hair, so she shaved. No one gave her a razor. She used a piece of metal, dull and chipped. It pulled more than it cut. The skin bled. No one cared. The point was to look smooth, not feel okay. If she missed a patch, someone noticed. If she bled too much, she covered it with a cloth and waited. It wasn't hygiene. It was maintenance, like how someone polishes a tool they don't care about as long as it works. They told her to smell like herbs, but the herbs ran out, so she used crushed leaves, sometimes dried hay, rubbed them into her skin until the scent took hold. It didn't last. The room's smells replaced them with its own. Still, she tried every morning, every night, even when her arms ached. Some girls hid garlic in their dress seams, not to smell better, but to cover something worse. If a man didn't like the scent, he left. If too many left, the girl got punished, so garlic stayed. Some tried lemon peel, some tried charcoal, some burned cloth and let the smoke cover their body. The tricks kept changing. The need stayed the same. If a girl was seen as too clean, she got other kinds of clients, the ones who thought she was special. That meant more pressure, more pain. Some girls stopped trying. They let the smell come. It kept the worst men away. Sometimes, other times, it didn't matter. The instructions never stopped. How to sit, how to breathe, how to act like she had no smell, no dirt, no sores. She nodded and did as told. Not because she believed it helped, but because doing nothing felt worse. You just did what came next. Then I lay down and waited for morning. The cloth didn't get softer. The vinegar didn't sting less. The twig didn't freshen the mouth. But the motion stayed. They became the rhythm of the room. Each wipe, each rinse, each stroke of the hand along the leg or behind the ear. It didn't care. It wasn't self-respect. It was a checklist. They were taught to be clean in the same way furniture is dusted, not because it matters, but because someone else will be looking. Next, we'll look closer at how bathing was handled when everyone shared a single basin, and why even that small act brought its risks. There was only one tub. It sat in the back room, half sunk into the ground, made of old wood bound by rusted iron hoops. The surface was no longer smooth. Splinters stuck out near the rim. Stains ran down its side like dried sap. No one asked where the water came from. They only knew that when it was there, it didn't stay clean for long. The first girl in had the best of it. She scooped from the top, quick and quiet. The water might still be clear then, or at least not too cloudy. She worked fast, not for privacy, but because she knew what came next. As soon as she stepped away, the next girl dipped in, stirring everything up. Hair, skin, old soap scum, bits of cloth, maybe blood. If someone had a wound, the water held it. If someone had just finished work, the water absorbed that too. There was no order, just whoever was bold enough to push forward. The quiet ones waited longer and got the worst. At the bottom, the water turned thick, cold, heavy. A greasy film floated on top. Bits of leaf, loose strands of hair, and streaks of reddish brown floated with it. They didn't scrub. There were no brushes, only hands and scraps of cloth. They wiped the parts that mattered, if they could. Sometimes they rinsed only their legs, sometimes just between the thighs. There wasn't enough water or space for a full wash, and if you lingered, someone would complain or worse. Imagine going to a spa where the luxury is sharing someone else's dirt. Only this time, you paid with your health, not your money. There were days the tub went untouched, not because the girls didn't need it, but because the water smelled too strong, like rotting wood and sour oil. Someone had used it after bleeding. No one said it loud, but they all knew. The house mother still made them line up one by one. No excuses. You wiped what you could and pretended not to gag. The water wasn't changed each time. That would waste firewood, and firewood cost money. Instead, someone poured in a new bucket now and then to freshen it up. It just made the murk deeper. One girl tried boiling herbs to add to the mixture. She got slapped for wasting them. Herbs were for selling, not bathing. The floor was always wet. The boards warped from years of soaking and trampling. Slime built up between the cracks. If you stepped wrong, your foot would slide. They kept an old rag near the door to wipe the worst puddles, but it was never enough. Slips and falls were common. No one offered help. You cleaned up and got out of the way. Compared to today, when even public gyms have individual showers, this was closer to livestock care than human hygiene. There was no towel. You used your dress if it was nearby, or let the air do the work. Girls stood around dripping quietly. Some pulled their arms in, trying to stay warm. Others just stared forward, waiting for someone to leave so they could move. Steam never rose in that room. The water was never hot. If it had warmth, it faded by the time the third or fourth girl stepped in. Privacy didn't exist. You saw everything, scars, bruises, infections. Some girls avoided eye contact. Others looked openly, maybe to see who was worse off. The youngest usually cried the first few times. After that, they stopped reacting. Eyes dull, mouths tight, movement slow. It became routine, just another chore. Nobody taught them how to clean properly. They did what others did, rubbed what others rubbed, used the same corner of the same rag, even if it smelled. No one said the word infection. No one used soap unless a client had left some behind. Even then, it was used sparingly and mostly for the front parts. If a girl took too long, someone knocked on the wall. If she tried to leave before going in, she got dragged back. Clean was relative. It didn't mean spotless. It meant passable. If the next client didn't complain, it was good enough. If he did, the girl paid later in bruises or lost work. What stayed with me wasn't the filth, but how quickly we got used to it. You stop noticing when everyone smells the same. They said nothing when a girl bled into the water. They said nothing when a rash spread down someone's leg. They said nothing when a scab opened and floated for a moment before sinking. Silence was easier than shame, and shame didn't help you earn anything. Some girls tried to bathe at night when fewer eyes watched, but the water was colder then, stiff with whatever had settled. If they made noise, they got scolded for waking others. If they lit a candle, they had to return it afterward. And even if they got there first, the tub wasn't empty. It had never been emptied properly, not for months. Over time, the skin began to itch. Small sores formed under arms, between fingers, in creases that no one could reach well. They scratched in private, hid the flakes, avoided asking questions because asking meant someone might see, and being seen meant being judged or removed. When the smell got too strong, someone threw straw on the floor, not to clean, just to cover. They swept it out once a week. Maybe a rat had drowned in the tub once. They fished it out with a stick and used the water anyway. That was the way it worked. The water was there. You used it or you didn't. Either way, no one listened when you spoke about it. That wasn't what mattered. You were supposed to get in, clean up, get out, and make room for the next girl. Next, we'll move on to the clothing they were forced to wear again and again, and how each stain held more than just a colour. Not everyone noticed it right away, but eventually the clothes told their own story. The dresses they wore day after day held on to more than just fabric creases. These garments soaked up everything from sweat and bodily fluids to the lingering scent of every man who had touched them. Some of these women had only one gown. It was their working dress, sleeping dress, and sometimes even their burial dress. The fabric wasn't just worn out. It was stained in ways no soap could fix and smelled of a dozen nights. Changing clothes wasn't really an option. New garments cost more than most of what they earned in a week, and the owners of the brothel didn't hand out spares unless there was a death. Even then, the new dress might have belonged to someone who had just collapsed the day before. If a woman did try to wash hers, she couldn't use good soap or fresh water. A quick rinse in a bucket and a squeeze on the stones outside would have to do. Then she would hang it near the alley where chickens wandered and chamber pots were emptied. That was considered clean enough. It's hard to imagine wearing the same dress soaked in old fluids, but that was the norm, not the exception. And it wasn't just about cost. There was superstition mixed into it too. Some believed that regular clients grew used to the smell of a particular woman's dress. They came back not just for the face or the voice, but for the scent they had grown familiar with. It was like a poor man's perfume, worn not on the skin, but stitched into every fold of wool or linen. Changing that too suddenly might drive the client away. So women were told not to make their clothes too clean, not to smell too fresh. Familiar dirt, they said, was better than strange cleanliness. Ironically, the few who tried to smell better often got into trouble. A dress that smelled too floral raised suspicions. Where did she get the perfume? Was it stolen from the madam's stash or worse? Was she hiding something? A wound? A disease? People whispered fast, and in a place where trust barely existed, being too clean could be just as dangerous as being filthy. Women learned to strike a balance, dirty enough to blend in, not so dirty as to drive customers off. In a modern context, that's like being punished for using deodorant at the office. And then there were rules about the actual act of cleaning. You couldn't take too long. You couldn't ask for extra clothes if someone spilled oil or wine on your dress. You weren't supposed to complain. You were expected to keep moving, to serve the next man, to act like the stain didn't matter if it smelled stronger than usual. Just tie a scrap of fabric around your waist. If it sticks to your thighs in the heat, Just ignore the discomfort. In that world, practicality always won over dignity. There were no pretty undergarments or fresh linens. Most of the time, they wore nothing underneath. Some even cut slits into their skirts to make the work faster. After all, they didn't have time to undress and redress for every man fully. That would slow down business, and time was money. Every second between one man leaving and another knocking was counted. The idea of washing something until it felt truly clean was foreign. Nobody had extra hands to scrub seams or scrape off old wax or blood. The madame didn't care as long as the customer didn't walk out the door. And the customers, many of whom weren't exactly fresh themselves, rarely noticed or mentioned the condition of the clothes unless it was overwhelmingly bad. One man's filth was another man's comfort. It's strange how in that setting, hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was actively discouraged. On some days, the dresses got so stiff with dried residue that the fabric could stand on its own for a moment after being removed. Women would shake them out in the alley like rugs, dust flying everywhere, bits of straw and dried herbs falling from the folds. Then they'd step right back into them, like slipping into a memory they couldn't erase. Some tied belts around their waist to hold the fabric up, not for fashion, but to keep it from dragging through the filth on the floor. They didn't wear shoes indoors. Many walked barefoot through dirt and spilled liquids. When they lay down, the same hem that had touched the floor all day now curled around their legs on the bed. Their own skin rubbed against the grime that had been collected from dozens of others. But no one spoke of it. They simply got used to it. Even in colder months, they couldn't wash and hang a dress without risking it staying wet for days. A damp garment in the winter meant chills, rashes, or worse. So they often chose to leave the dress as it was, letting time dry the spots, letting the air soften the edges. In the rare event that someone brought new fabric or a gifted dress, it was either stolen or hidden away. Wearing it would draw attention, and attention was rarely safe. Sometimes, on quieter mornings, a woman might take a moment to shake out her dress and pick off clumps of hair or hardened oil. That was her version of care, a private act, not for beauty, but for survival. A cleaner dress might earn her a slightly better paying customer, or maybe just a moment of feeling more like a person and less like an object. But even that was fleeting because the dress was never really hers. It belonged to the job, and the job did not stop for laundry. What stayed with me most was how quickly a woman's own body became just another surface to wipe clean. No matter how stained, no matter how foul, the dress was still expected to do its part. It had to keep up the appearance of function. It had to hold itself together just like the women inside it. And so the fabric sagged, the threads loosened, the colors faded, the smell deepened, and day after day, night after night, the dress returned to work. Up next, we'll take a closer look at what passed for menstrual hygiene in this world. Spoiler: it was neither clean nor private. There was no exception for certain days. No matter what their bodies were going through, the women were still expected to work. Periods did not stop the customers from coming, and so the women had no choice but to keep going. Whether their wombs ached or not, they were not offered rest. They were not excused. The expectation was cruel and straightforward. Do your job, even if you are bleeding. They used whatever was available. There were no manufactured products or proper clothes made for this purpose. Most settled for torn rags, usually already stained from prior use. These were not fresh pieces of linen, carefully cut and washed. They were scraps of discarded fabric, sometimes taken from old bed sheets, sometimes torn off the hem of a ruined dress. Once folded thick enough, the rag was tucked between the legs, held in place by the weight of their undergarments, or more often, by nothing at all. Imagine being forced to continue physical labor while a filthy wet rag shifts between your legs. These rags absorbed little. After only a short time, they grew damp and heavy, the sour smell of old blood mixing with whatever perfume or oil had been applied to the body earlier in the day. The longer they were used, the more likely they were to shift out of place. It was not rare for the rag to fall out completely during a visit from a client. In those cases, the women had to reach under themselves, retrieve it silently, and go on without a word. Sometimes they could rinse the cloth in a corner bucket and try again, but most of the time they just continued without it. The embarrassment was private because no one else cared. Not the client, not the madam, not even the other girls who were too busy with their own struggles. Blood on the sheets was just part of the job. If the stain was noticed, someone might toss a layer of cloth over it before the next man arrived. If not, the next girl lay in it. No one had the time or energy to argue about what was clean and what wasn't. The rags were rarely appropriately washed. The women might rinse them quickly in a basin, then hang them to dry on a rope by the hearth or out the back window in damp seasons. They stayed moist for days. They picked up mold and took on a stiff texture, but were used again anyway. There were no replacements. Even if they asked, the answer was usually the same. Figure it out yourself. Modern women complain when the store runs out of their preferred brand. Here they made do with whatever cloth didn't already smell like death. Many suffered infections, vaginal burning, constant itching, sores that wouldn't close. But unless it interfered with the ability to serve, it was ignored. No one examined them. No one offered herbs or picuses. In some brothels, the only treatment was vinegar or wine poured over the area to clean it out. The sting was excruciating and often made things worse, but there was no alternative. Complaining was discouraged. Suffering was assumed. They were told to stay silent. Weakness was frowned upon. If a girl said she was in too much pain, the others looked away, afraid of being associated with someone who might be thrown out. Being dismissed wasn't dramatic. It just meant she was told to leave, and another girl took her place that night. No farewell, no coin for medicine, just the end of a name spoken. I can't help but feel that many of them didn't even know what was wrong with their own bodies. Some bled longer than they should have. Others stopped bleeding entirely. Their cycles grew irregular from stress, starvation, and constant physical strain. But none of this mattered to those around them. Their bodies were expected to be usable regardless of the internal damage. A woman who bled too much risked being labelled as ruined. One who bled too little might be assumed infertile or diseased. There was no winning. To try to cope, a few of them tried creative measures. Some stuffed dried moss into their undergarments. Others used layers of crushed herbs to dull the smell. A handful even attempted to sew simple pads using leftover scraps from discarded dresses. But these makeshift solutions never lasted long. The moss dried and crumbled. The sewn pads grew stiff with repeated use and were thrown away. The herbal coverings helped for a few hours, but then just blended into the general mess. Privacy was impossible. The shared rooms meant that others could see or smell what was happening. A woman trying to change her rag in the corner might be watched by two others waiting their turn with a client. No one spoke of it, but the silence carried the weight of shame. They all knew. They all understood. They just didn't talk about it. The worst moments came during the busiest nights, when the door never stopped opening, when the women had no time to clean themselves, no time to check if the rag was still in place. There were stories of women fainting mid-visit, pale from pain or blood loss, and being dragged into the back room to lie down for a while. Sometimes they got back up, sometimes they didn't. The floor under the beds often carried the proof: dried drops of blood, scraps of cloth that had fallen unnoticed, the smell of iron that no candle or incense could fully cover. By morning, it mixed with everything else, with wine, with sweat, with the smoke from the hearth. The stench settled into the wood. It was part of the room, part of the job. It wasn't neglect. It was resignation. They didn't believe anything better was possible. No one asked if they were comfortable. No one gave advice on hygiene. The girls learned from each other, sometimes passing down methods that had worked a little better for someone before. But mostly, they just endured. Even now, when I think about it, I can't decide what's worse: the physical discomfort or the total lack of care. To bleed in pain and be expected to smile through it, to be told to adjust the rag and move on. There was no end to the bleeding, only brief pauses between shifts, and when those rags finally wore too thin to hold anything, they became tinder for the fire, their last use, kindling for someone else's warmth. Coming up, we'll look at how something as simple as a razor became a daily tool for damage: blunt blades, raw skin, and the constant pressure to appear clean. Not every injury came from the men. Some of the worst ones came from their own hands, or more specifically, from the blades they were told to use. Shaving was not optional. The women were expected to remove all visible hair on their bodies, especially in the places where men looked most. Hair meant unclean. Smoothness was part of the illusion they had to maintain, no matter what it cost their skin. They had no proper razors. What they used were old copper blades, sometimes dull, sometimes chipped. Others made do with thin pieces of scrap metal or broken knife edges. These tools were not made for precision. They cut roughly and unpredictably. The women often had to press hard or go over the same area repeatedly just to remove the stubborn patches. Skin was scraped raw in the process. Nicks were common. Bleeding was routine. If pain made you flinch, you weren't cut out for the job. There was no shaving cream, no soap to soften the follicles. Most didn't even have warm water to rinse with. Oil could have helped, but it was considered a luxury reserved for the customer's pleasure, not the girl's comfort. A few tried to use spit or leftover fat from the kitchen to get the blade to glide more easily, but the result was still uneven. The skin turned red, then swollen, sometimes hot to the touch within hours. Rashes formed quickly. The constant friction of movement didn't help. Their thighs rubbed together all day, trapping sweat and dust and any bacteria that entered through the open scratches. They were told to shave regularly, even daily if possible. Clients expected it. A woman with visible stubble might be called filthy or unkempt. The expectation was clear: be smooth, smell pleasant, and act inviting. No one cared how that was achieved. It was a rule like any other, enforced more by pressure than violence, but just as unbreakable. Nowadays, people throw out a whole razor if it tugs once. Back then, they just kept cutting. Some women bled so often that they no longer reacted when they saw the streaks. They wiped the red away with the back of a hand, then carried on. A cloth might be pressed between the legs to soak the spot. Then it was back to work. There was no healing time, no bandages, only a kind of practiced tolerance. You did what needed to be done. The worst were the infected cuts. A small nick could swell overnight, turning purple and oozing pus. The women knew what this meant. Pain when sitting, pain when walking, pain when touched. Some attempted home remedies, a splash of wine, a dab of crushed herbs, or even ash mixed with water. But these solutions were unreliable. Infection spread, sometimes up the thigh, sometimes deeper. Still, they worked. Stopping was not allowed. The shaving ritual was usually done in a corner of the room, using a bit of water poured into a bowl. A cloth served as a mirror substitute. They could only guess by touch and habit where the blade had passed. Some helped each other, especially the younger ones, who hadn't yet mastered the balance between speed and care. Accidents happened often. It was common to hear a hiss of breath, or see someone press their fingers quickly over a fresh wound. I don't think most of them felt clean after shaving, just relieved it was over until the next time. Not every woman shaved completely. A few left a thin strip or shaped the hair to appear more styled, depending on what the men preferred. But even then, the hair was trimmed as close as possible. No one wanted to be known as the one with a coarse patch. Reputation mattered. So did competition. One girl's unshaven leg might cost her a client. That meant no food, no protection, no favor from the madam. In the hot months, things worsened. Sweat made the skin sting. The shaving wounds didn't dry properly and stayed moist for hours. Flies and gnats hovered around the irritated flesh. Some women wrapped thin linen strips around their legs, hoping to keep the bugs away. Others simply tried not to move too much between visits. The act of shaving became mechanical, a thing to get through quickly before the first client arrived. No one viewed it as self-care. It was damage control, maintenance of a product. Their bodies weren't their own. They were surfaces to be kept presentable, like furniture in a cheap inn. Some even shaved their arms or necklines, depending on how much skin they planned to show. The blade traveled across collarbones and along the edge of the jaw. One slip could mean a visible scar. Still, they kept doing it. Some grew used to the feeling. Others never did. The new girls bled more than most. They hadn't learned when not to press too hard yet. There was no disposal for old blades. They were reused until they rusted or broke. Then someone found another shard. Some women wrapped their blades in cloth to keep them sharper longer. Others simply stored them loose in a drawer or under the mattress. Cuts from sleeping on them were not unheard of. They didn't talk about the pain. Shaving was just another step in the routine, like combing your hair or brushing your teeth. If either of those had also come with open wounds. One girl was known for having steady hands and would sometimes help the others. She shaved in silence, never reacting to the blood. She was respected, even if no one said it. Eventually, the body stopped healing as quickly. Cuts took longer to close. The skin lost its elasticity. Some women gave up and let the hair grow back. Those were the ones who stopped caring whether a client returned. Most didn't last long after that. Coming next is the story of how they tried to clean themselves after every visit. No bath, no time, just whatever they could grab in a hurry to wipe away the evidence. Even when the men left, the discomfort remained. The women still had to find ways to clean themselves, though clean wasn't really the right word for it. They didn't have access to fresh water, soap, or proper cloths. What they had were rough options that stung more than they helped. The goal wasn't hygiene in the sense of health. It was about removing visible traces. No blood, no semen, no smell that would offend the next man in line. Some of them used alcohol, not the kind anyone would drink willingly. It was rough, unfiltered, and burned on contact. A splash of that between the legs was their version of a cleanse. The sting was immediate. Many clenched their teeth or held their breath when they poured it on. It didn't matter how raw the skin already was. Pain was expected. No one asked if it was too much. That wasn't the concern. Others used salt water, a pot of hot water, often left over from boiling rags or food scraps, would be mixed with a generous handful of salt. They would squat over it, holding their skirts out of the way, and try to rinse thoroughly. Sometimes they poured it from a small clay jug. Other times, they dipped a cloth in the mixture and pressed it directly to their skin. The burn was more severe when cuts or ulcers were already present. Who needs enemies when your cleaning routine feels like punishment? There was no privacy during these moments. Women shared corners of rooms or narrow back spaces behind the brothel. There wasn't enough light to see clearly. They did it quickly, quietly, sometimes still half naked from the last customer. It wasn't about feeling refreshed. It was just a reset, a way to look acceptable enough for the next one. Between each man, they barely had time to breathe. Most couldn't afford to rest, so after a rushed rinse, they simply patted themselves dry with the same cloth they used all week, one that had long since stopped absorbing much. If there was no cloth, they used the hem of their dress. Then they stood up, adjusted their clothing, and waited. Infection was common, but they didn't have the words for it. There was just an ache, a heat, a swelling that wouldn't go away. Some of them walked with a limp by the end of the day. Others started to avoid sitting between clients. They adapted because they had to. No one taught them another way. Some women tried to make their own mixtures, crushed herbs in warm water, ash stirred into vinegar, or even honey diluted with beer. I heard from someone who heard from someone else that it might help, but most of these things just irritated the skin further. Still, anything was better than nothing. At least they felt like they were doing something. Today, people panic over a mild rash. These women bled daily and called it normal. There was no set rule for how to clean yourself after sex. The brothel didn't provide a schedule or checklist. The girls learned by watching others, by doing what worked fast, what didn't attract complaints. If a man said he smelled something bad, she might lose her spot for the night or worse, get blamed for driving away customers. The older girls gave advice, but it wasn't always kind. Use more salt, hold it in longer, don't flinch. They said things like that because they'd already stopped hoping it could feel better. They knew the body wasn't built to heal fast enough when used like that, but they also knew no one cared. For some women, the repeated burning became so common that they stopped reacting to it. They would wince slightly, then carry on. The skin around their thighs and groin grew dark and leathery. It lost sensitivity. That was a small mercy. But even numb skin could break open under pressure. There were no medical checkups, no ointments or creams, no soothing baths, just the same routine every day. Work, rinse, wipe, repeat. By the end of the week, some women had to lie down between clients, not because they were tired, but because standing made the pain sharper. I don't think they believed in relief anymore, just in surviving until the next moment. A few women tried sitting in cool water when it was available, but water wasn't clean. It was usually the same basin that had been used for others earlier. Floating hairs, flecks of blood, pieces of leaf or dirt. It didn't soothe. It just spread the irritation around. Sometimes out of desperation, they did nothing at all. Just wiped with a dry cloth and hoped no one noticed. This often led to stronger smells and more severe infections. But what other choice was there? If a client left angry, she might be punished. If she cleaned too slowly, she might be called lazy. There was no safe way to get through the day. The scent of strong alcohol often clung to their thighs, not from drinking, but from rinsing. Some tried to mask it with oil or herbs tucked into their skirts, but nothing lasted long. After 10 minutes of sweat and friction, the smell returned. They got used to it. They told themselves it was better than nothing. Over time, the repeated damage built up. Scar tissue formed. Some girls could no longer bear the rinse. They faked it, splashing water nearby just to be seen cleaning. Others cried silently while doing it, especially the young ones who had not yet gone numb. And yet, despite all this, the expectation never changed. A woman had to be clean enough to be touched, but not so clean that she seemed like she was trying to be better than the rest. If her skin smelled too much like perfume, she might be accused of stealing. If it smelled like salt and iron, she was just one of many. Next comes the story of their hair. Not the glossy, cared-for locks, as you might imagine, but the tangled strands crusted with sweat and other things they never had the time or tools to remove. There was one part of the body they stopped bothering with sooner than most, the hair. Not because it didn't matter, but because it simply wasn't manageable anymore. Long shifts, rough hands, and filth from men left more than bruises. It clung to them, literally from the scalp down. At some point, they just let the hair go. Washing it wasn't easy. Water was cold and scarce. Most of the time, they just bent over a bucket and dumped what they could find. There were no soaps designed for hair. They used whatever was on hand. Sometimes even coarse sand or ashes to try to scrape the grease off. Some rubbed their scalps raw with their fingernails, scratching until the skin bled. The buildup of oil, sweat, and skin flakes turned into thick crust that only came off with pain. The smell was always there. Hair holds scent longer than skin, and there it soaked up every odor from the brothel. Candle wax, mold, old wine, and worse. No amount of rinsing could truly remove it. It followed them even when they left the room. At markets, in alleys, on church steps, people turned their heads, not because they were, but because they stank like one. If shame had a scent, it probably smelled like damp scalp and stale sex. They tried to braid it, tie it up, cover it, but it kept sticking to their necks. In the summer, the heat turned their heads into dripping messes. In the winter, it froze stiff, sticking out in unnatural angles by morning. They wore scarves, not for fashion, but to hide how bad it had gotten. Some women gave up completely and cut their hair off, not all at once, and not cleanly. They tore it in tangles until whole clumps came loose, or they shaved it with broken blades. The stubble grew in patches, and they felt cold at night, but at least they didn't have to deal with lice crawling behind their ears. Lice were a constant companion. There wasn't a single woman who hadn't scratched her scalp bloody at least once a week. They learned to live with the bites, the crawling, the eggs stuck at the root. Picking them out one by one took too long, so they stopped. And just like with everything else, they let it settle. Another discomfort added to the pile. Combs were shared. 5 or 6 women passed around a wooden one. It was never cleaned, teeth broken, worn smooth with oil and dirt. Anyone watching closely could see the strands from 3 different heads wrapped in it. They didn't have time to pull them out. The goal was to yank through their knots and move on. People today complain about split ends. These women would have killed for a tangle-free day. Hair got tangled with everything, not just dirt, but the work itself. Some women had strands glued together with semen. Others had blood dried in patches that refused to come loose. When they tried to pull it out, more hair came with it. The bald spots weren't hidden anymore, and no one pointed them out. everyone had them. They didn't wear perfumes or oils in their hair. Those were luxuries reserved for the upper class. At best, they had a pinch of lavender if a generous client left some behind. But even then, it barely made a difference. One night in the brothel was enough to wipe out any attempt at fragrance. Wearing head coverings helped a little. It stopped the worst of the looks when they went outside. But inside, the clothes came off and the truth showed. Matted curls, greasy layers, tufts missing from rough handling. Some women brushed their fingers through their own hair and gave up halfway, too tired to keep going. I think hair became a symbol of what they couldn't control anymore. They used to care. When they were younger, they braided their hair before bed. They took pride in the length, the colour, the shine. But after a few seasons in the brothel, no one asked anymore if it looked good. It just had to be out of the way. Older women advised the younger ones to keep it short. Less chance of pulling, less chance of tangling. One girl even burned off the bottom half of her hair after catching lice for the 5th time in a month. The smell of singed hair filled the brothel for hours. No one commented. Everyone understood. Scalp infections were common. No one had the tools or time to clean them. Open sores became part of the routine. They stopped reacting to the pain. It was just another thing to bear while kneeling or lying flat. Some women covered the worst patches with ash to dry them out. Others just pressed a cloth to the spots and hoped they wouldn't drip during work. Between the heat, the friction, the dirt, and the constant touching, no part of their head didn't hurt by week's end. But they couldn't complain. The men didn't want to see that. They wanted the illusion. And that illusion didn't include bald spots or weeping sores. Hair was supposed to be part of a woman's charm. But here, it was just one more problem to manage in a place where no one had energy left. Some women tried to smile when brushing it, pretending they still cared. But the mirror was long gone, and with it, the habit of checking their reflection. Next, we'll take a closer look at how they dealt with their mouths. Not with words, but with rotten teeth, cracked lips, and breath no rinse could fix. The mouth was a battlefield. They fought on every day. They didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't have dentists, and no one taught them how to care for their teeth. What they had was desperation, tricks passed down from other women, and a constant fear of smelling too real. They knew what men expected. A mouth that seemed clean, a kiss that didn't stink. But their lives didn't match those expectations. What came out of their mouths often wasn't just words. It was the lingering taste of old wine, the metallic bite of blood, and the smell of decay that no one wanted to acknowledge. To cover the worst of it, they chewed whatever they could find. Mint sprigs, if they were lucky. Wild ginger roots, if someone brought them from outside. Parsley, dried cloves, even bitter wood bark, all passed from mouth to mouth until the sharpness numbed the tongue. They didn't chew to refresh themselves. They chewed to survive inspection. You can call it breath freshening if you like, but it was more like masking rot with something slightly less awful. They would scrape their teeth with sticks. Some broke twigs into sharp little tools and rubbed the surfaces of their murs. Sometimes it helped remove leftover food. Sometimes it just made their gums bleed more. The sticks weren't cleaned, of course, and the wounds festered. Their gums were swollen almost constantly, red, puffy, tender to the touch. Just the act of speaking too much could cause bleeding. They'd spit pink into the dirt and move on. There wasn't much choice. No one cared if they were in pain. The job had to be done. Blood or no blood. Charcoal was another trick. Crushed into powder, then smeared on the teeth with a cloth or finger. It made their mouths look black at first, but after rinsing, it left the illusion of cleaner teeth. Not white, not bright, just a little less yellow. It didn't fix the problems underneath, but it distracted from them, and distraction was everything. These women learned to smile carefully, not wide, not open, just enough to look pleasant without revealing the rotting mers or the holes where teeth used to be. Lips pressed together tightly hid more than just silence. Lip color was added with old dried pigments, sometimes crushed berries, sometimes brick dust. Sometimes the mixtures made their mouths crack at the corners. They applied it with fingers, no mirrors, and hoped it didn't smear too fast. After hours of talking, kissing, and panting, the pigment dried into flakes that cut their skin open. In a world without lip balm, beauty came with cracked skin and sore corners. Cracks bled in the cold. Infections followed. Some had sores that never healed, making eating painful and drinking difficult. But again, they didn't stop. They covered what they could with cloths or simply turned their heads away when breathing near clients. Tooth loss happened early. By their 20s, many had gaps along the sides or front. The back teeth went first, rotted from the inside until they simply fell out. The front ones chipped or loosened from rough treatment or grinding in their sleep. And since there was no replacement, they just learned to live with soft diets and careful chewing. Bad breath wasn't occasional. It was constant. The kind that hit others before they even opened their mouths. A mix of gum disease, decay, and food remnants that had no business staying in a human body for that long. The women knew it. They weren't blind to the disgusted looks or the subtle flinches from certain clients. But they also knew the solution wasn't in their reach. No one was going to hand them a mint. No one was going to offer a rinse. All they could do was chew what they found, rinse with stale ale or old well water, and keep their distance when possible. Some women tried to clean their tongues with rags. Wrapped around a finger, the rag scraped the white film from the surface. It made them gag sometimes. Others just rinsed and spat, hoping it was enough, but the results never lasted more than a few hours. Modern mouthwash ads promise fresh breath for 12 hours. These women would have settled for 12 minutes. There were moments of shame. Not all of them were numb. Some still cared what they looked like. Some tried to keep their lips from drying out or asked around for fresher herbs. But every time they cleaned up, the next client dragged them right back into filth. The mouth became another place of pain, another thing they had to fake. Smiles, moans, whispers. It was a tool, not a part of them anymore. It performed and then it rested in silence, sore and swollen until the next night. I think the worst part wasn't the bleeding or the rot. It was knowing that no one cared unless it interfered with their service. As long as they looked acceptable on the outside, the inside didn't matter. A few tried to hide the missing teeth with clever mouth positions, a tight-lipped smirk, a bowed head, laughter into a sleeve. But those were tricks that stopped working when drunk men forced their mouths open. Then it was all visible. The missing rows, the red gums, the tiny clumps of food still stuck in mirrors that shouldn't be there anymore. No one offered comfort. No one asked if they were all right. At best, another woman might pass along a bit of ginger or a cloth to wipe the blood. That was the extent of compassion. Their mouths were tired. Tired from pretending, from stretching too wide, from holding back cries when the pain surged. But they did it anyway because there wasn't a choice. Coming next, we'll move lower again to the skin. The constant itch, the cracks, and the stink. They never quite escaped. The face could be hidden with powder or kept in shadow. The hair could be covered with cloth. But the hands had no such luxury. They were always visible, always busy, always touched, grabbed, or used. And in those hands, the reality of their lives was carved more deeply than on any other part of their body. Their fingers cracked from repeated rubbing, the skin around the knuckles peeled or hardened at the end of every shift. Their palms stung from wiping themselves down with rags soaked in alcohol or water mixed with ash. It wasn't for hygiene, it was for appearances. There were no soaps made for women like them. What they had was whatever made things look less filthy than they were. Ash was easy to get. Some had access to strong wine or sour ale, which was poured onto a rag and scrubbed across the hands until the smell of others faded. But the alcohol didn't clean. It dried. And after weeks, months, years of this routine, their skin began to split. In medieval brothels, hand sanitizer came with splinters and blood. The backs of their hands grew rough. Some spots hardened like bark, while others remained tender and thin. In cold weather, the skin broke open. In hot months, sweat made the cracks sting even more. They kept working. Fingernails were rarely whole. They snapped on wood, tore on clothing, bent backward under pressure. No one trimmed them properly. No one cared. The sharp edges turned black with dirt, with dried fluids, with the grit of whatever was left behind after a night's work. There wasn't time or reason to clean under the nails. They were tools, not ornaments. Once in a while, someone would bite hers off, a nervous habit, or just the fastest way to remove what was bothering her. That only led to infections, swollen cuticles, and sometimes pus beneath the skin. But even then, they kept using those hands. Their fingers often smelled of smoke, blood, and sweat, all baked into the skin. Washing helped very little. The rags were reused, the water shared, and the effort never quite reached the base of the problem. If a man today found a date's hands in that condition, he'd probably call pest control before he called again. But back then, clients didn't notice or didn't care. Their attention was elsewhere. Hands were expected to perform, not to please. They were supposed to be useful, not attractive. If the nails were jagged or the skin flaking, it made no difference to the outcome. Some women tried covering their hands with cloth, tying strips of linen around their fingers or palms. But these wraps got dirty quickly, and if they wore them while serving customers, it often raised questions or suspicion, so they stopped. Infections started small, a little swelling, a red patch, a soreness at the base of a nail. Then came the heat, the pus, the fever. Some women had fingers that turned dark, a few of them, but those were the worst cases. Most simply lived with constant irritation, bandaged with whatever they could tear from old clothing. No one gave them ointment. No one handed them salves or oils. They rubbed animal fat or cooking grease on the skin when they could, not for healing, but for softness. It helped hands move over skin more easily and reduced friction during work, but it didn't treat the damage. Their joints ached from cold floors and repetitive movements. Some hands trembled when resting. Others became stiff in the morning and only loosened up after working. These weren't the hands of young idle girls. They were the hands of women whose entire lives had been compressed into labor, done in dim rooms on hard beds. When I imagine them now, I don't see silk or perfume. I see fingers too tired to bend, nails hidden by dirt, and palms that had forgotten what softness meant. You could tell a lot from how a woman held her hands. Some curled their fingers inward out of shame. Some kept them in their laps. Others folded their arms, hiding the worst of it beneath their sleeves. But no matter how hard they tried to hide it, those hands told the truth. The smell never really left. The mix of body, oil, blood, and whatever else passed through them each day soaked into the cracks. Even after a rinse, even after a scrub, it clung. Some rubbed herbs into their palms, mint, thyme, rosemary. It masked the worst of it for a while, but it didn't erase anything. Over time, they stopped noticing the pain, the stinging when touching cloth, the burning when rubbing rough fabric. Their nerves adjusted, or maybe they just gave up caring. The damage became part of the routine. Some younger girls came in with smooth hands, soft and pink from farm work or home chores. Within weeks, their fingers became as rough as the others. The change happened fast. It always did. The brothel had its own way of stripping the skin, not just from the body, but from memory. They still used those hands to help one another, to wipe tears, to brush hair, to hold trembling arms. Even when bleeding, even when shaking, they reached out. The world may have seen them as ruined tools, but among themselves, they knew what those hands had carried. The worst wasn't always visible. Sometimes the pain wasn't in the skin or the nail, but in the feeling of being touched without wanting to be, having to grip when they wanted to pull away, holding still when everything inside screamed to move. And yet the next night they used those same hands again to work, to survive, because they had to. Next we'll move inward past the skin into the air they breathed, and the diseases no one talked about, but everyone feared. They could hide the cuts on their fingers. They could tie a cloth over a sore wrist, or wrap something around a swollen ankle. But there was one place they couldn't protect, couldn't avoid using, and couldn't speak about. Between the legs and around the inner thighs, the damage was constant, and it was the kind of pain that no one ever asked about because no one wanted the answer. The skin in that area was never given time to heal. Every day it was pulled, pushed, pressed, or rubbed. They sat on hard surfaces. They moved with speed when asked. They adjusted their bodies for different men, sometimes dozens in a row. And in all that movement, that tight space between the thighs took the brunt of the friction. If medieval brothels offered a loyalty card, the reward would have been permanent skin damage. Some women developed thick, dark patches of skin along the crease, where their thighs met their groin, not from dirt, but from pressure. That discoloration stayed no matter how much they washed. Other times, it wasn't thickening. It was the opposite. The skin thinned and cracked. Open spots where the fabric rubbed too long or too hard, or where sweat had made everything softer, easier to tear. Many wore nothing underneath, just a dress, maybe a thin slip. Sometimes not even that. When they bled, the fabric absorbed the blood. When they itched, they couldn't scratch in front of others. When it burned, they said nothing. A few walked with stiff legs, not because of modesty, but to avoid the feeling of skin rubbing against itself. They had no ointment, no cream. Some rubbed goose fat or oil, but that only worked if they had it. Others used spit, others did nothing. Boils formed, blisters, small red nodules that turned into sores. Some burst on their own. Some were scratched open in the night. Some became ulcers that didn't close. The smell was hard to ignore, even for those used to every other bad smell in the place. But they kept working. In today's world, one trip to the gynecologist would solve it. Back then, you'd be lucky to get a piece of clean cloth. Sometimes it wasn't just the skin. Lymph nodes near the groin swelled. A dull ache turned into a sharp pull each time they moved their legs. But if they limped, they risked punishment. If they asked for rest, they were told to tough up. There was no reward for honesty, no sympathy for pain. They were expected to function. They were expected to stay silent, even if walking hurt, even if sitting stung, even if lying down sent a jolt through the nerves in their hips. A few tried to cushion the area. They rolled old cloth into bundles and tied them between their legs when they could, but that only caused more friction. And once it soaked through, it became useless. Worse, if they were seen adjusting it or hiding it, they could be accused of infection, theft, or weakness. What surprises me most is not the wounds themselves, but the way they were carried like secrets, buried beneath skirts, denied even in whispers. The bruises didn't fade. They just changed color from purple to brown to green. Some looked like fingerprints, some like smudges. The skin around them remained tender, and the bone beneath ached. But no one marked time by how long it took to heal. They measured it in shifts, in the nights, in bodies. It was common for women to press a hand to their thighs as they sat down, not for modesty, but to brace for the sting. Many flinched without realizing. Some gripped their skirts tighter than they meant to. These little movements said everything, even when no one dared speak. When new girls arrived, they learned quickly. A few days of work, and their legs began to mirror the others. The burning, the soreness, the dull pain that followed them from bed to basin and back. They didn't ask for help. They copied what they saw. They learned which movements to avoid, how to sit with knees slightly apart to reduce rubbing, and how to breathe through the pain. Infections developed in those wounds. Some climbed into the groin and stayed there. A few developed hard lumps that never went away. Others ended up with fevers that took them down in a matter of days. Still, nothing changed. In the rare case a woman collapsed, the others would carry her to the side, wipe her with a cloth, and let her rest until she could return. There were no doctors. No healing herbs are reserved for them. The priority was always who was next in line, not who was bleeding underneath. They weren't allowed to talk about it, not because it was shameful, but because it would be inconvenient. Men didn't want to know. Matrons didn't want excuses. The only time their groins were discussed was when something looked abnormal, something suspicious. Then they'd be questioned, maybe even thrown out. So they kept the damage to themselves. They walked slowly when no one was looking. They washed gently if they had the chance. They folded the cloth and prayed it wouldn't rub more skin away. At night, they lay on their sides, not from comfort, but to keep pressure off the most damaged areas. When they woke, the soreness returned instantly. There was no recovery, only repetition. Some began to avoid sitting altogether. They leaned, they stood, they shifted constantly to find the least painful position. Others became so used to the ache that they forgot what it felt like to move without pain. Even in death, their thighs told the story. Cold, stiff legs with marks that hadn't healed in months. Groins still darkened from friction, still open from ulcers, still marked by lives lived in silence. No one asked where it hurt. No one offered to look. And yet, if someone had taken the time, they would have found that everything was written there, in the places that worked hardest, suffered most, and received the least care of all. In the next part, we'll move even deeper into the hidden infections, the things no one could see, but that slowly ate them from the inside. There were no scheduled breaks, no moments set aside just for washing. Time in the brothel moved according to men's needs, not the women's. When one man left, another would soon appear. Between those visits, there was little thought given to hygiene or rest. For new girls, there was sometimes a pause. When they first arrived, they were often bathed or wiped down, not for their sake, but to make them more appealing. A fresh girl smelled cleaner, and clean meant valuable. It was an investment, one that didn't last long. Once she became part of the routine, the idea of a full body bath became laughable. She was expected to be ready always. Whether she had just worked, whether she was bleeding, whether she was shaking from cold or covered in another man's sweat, it didn't matter. In a place where clients came non-stop, personal hygiene was treated like an optional hobby. Tubs were rare, and the water inside was usually reused. A girl might be allowed to dip a cloth and wipe her arms or legs, but full baths were reserved for first impressions. Older women, even those not truly aged, were assumed to know how to get by without the luxury. They wiped themselves with anything they could find. A corner of a skirt, a sleeve, a rag that wasn't too dirty. If they had oil, they rubbed it under the arms or around the neck to mask smell. Most didn't. The smell of old linen, body fluids, smoke, and sweat followed them everywhere. No one pointed it out because everyone had it. The girls, the men, the floor, the bedding. It clung to skin and settled into fabric, and with time, it became part of the place. They were told not to waste time. There was no clock, but everyone knew what too long meant. If a girl disappeared into the back for more than a few minutes, someone would knock or shout. That time could be better spent earning. A bath was seen as selfish, so most didn't try. When work slowed, they collapsed. Sometimes they wiped between their legs with a cloth. Sometimes they didn't. They dropped wherever there was space on the floor against a wall, half naked or fully dressed. Whatever state they were in, they stayed like that until they were woken up. Imagine finishing a double shift at a fast food restaurant, soaked in grease, and being told to sleep in the supply closet and wake up for another shift in 10 minutes. That's what their nights felt like. They weren't given their clothes or bowls. If someone had a clean item, it was either taken or shared. If someone was seen washing, others often waited nearby to use what was left. Clean water became cloudy in seconds. Soap was rare. Scented oil was even rarer. Girls tried to rotate spots. The corner behind the stove was warmer, but it reeked of smoke and food. The bedroll under the stairs was quiet, but close to the chamber pot. Some even slept sitting, leaning on their knees to avoid touching dirty surfaces with too much skin. When someone asked for them while they were resting, they had to get up. No one said she's sleeping like it was a reason. If a man came and paid, the woman worked. Whether her eyes were red or her arms were trembling, even when they were sick, they weren't allowed long pauses. If they couldn't stand, they might work lying down. If they couldn't move much, someone might drag them into a better position. Most just went silent, saving their voice and their strength. What shocks me most isn't the dirt, but the silence they accepted as normal when their bodies needed care and no one gave it. They weren't expected to be clean. They were expected to seem willing. That meant staying on their feet or their knees or on their back depending on the request. The smell, the grime, the fluids. Those were background noise to the main event. When someone did wash, it wasn't for themselves. It was for a man who had paid extra. A man who preferred smooth skin. A man who wanted a fresh girl. Then, and only then, would she be sent to splash cold water on her chest or legs, or told to comb her hair. But those moments didn't last. As soon as he left, she returned to the others, dressed again in the same clothes, with the same feet and the same sweat, and she would sit there, still damp, still tired, waiting. Some lost track of how long it had been since their last proper wash. They remembered the first, But after that, the days blurred. 1 week turned into the next. They measured time by wounds, by visitors, by the number of girls that came and went, not by bars. Only when a girl was new or on the verge of dying did anyone notice her scent. And even then, it was rarely spoken about. It was easier to ignore than to change. Easier to cover with something that burned the nose than to start over with soap and water. Some tried to change their own routine. They waited until night, dipped a cloth in the rain barrel, and wiped under their arms or behind their knees. But if they were caught wasting water or using someone else's rag, they risked being punished, and so they let it slide. Another night, another shift, another man. They told themselves they would wash tomorrow. But when tomorrow came, so did the same rules, the same lack of time, the same disregard. Eventually, their bodies adjusted, their noses dulled, their skin stopped reacting, their feet became calloused, their backs bent, and still, no one gave them the simple thing they needed most: time to clean themselves without guilt. In the next part, we'll look closely at what happened when they tried to heal. Not with rest, not with comfort, but with whatever scraps they could find. The quiet war they fought just to stay alive a little longer. Some things couldn't be washed off, no matter how hard they tried. The human body had a way of holding on to smells, and when dozens of different men came through the same narrow hallway each week, the scent of each one clung to the women's skin like damp cloth. No one ever said it aloud, but they could tell what kind of man had just left by what still lingered in the air. There were days when the rooms reeked of thick sweat, sour and heavy, especially in the summer months when no one had bathed in weeks. Some men arrived with the stench of livestock or wet leather, while others reeked of urine or rotting teeth. Then there were the ones who wore too much perfume, as if they thought drowning themselves in oil would hide the dirt beneath. The girls couldn't pick who came through the door, and they had no say in what smells would stick to them. After one visit, they might be covered in sweat from head to toe. After another, it might be the bitter stench of tobacco or the sickly sweet scent of opium. By the end of a long night, their bodies held a dozen different layers of odor, none of them their own. They became like walking tapestries of every man who passed through, stitched together by scent rather than thread. At first, some tried to fight it. They scrubbed their arms or wiped their necks, hoping to erase the smell, but it always returned. And if one man's scent was too strong, the next might complain. They learned quickly that it was better to leave it than risk upsetting the rhythm. They tried masking it with cheap oils or dried herbs, a splash of rose water behind the ears, crushed mint tucked into the top of the dress. Sometimes a pinch of lavender rubbed into the wrist, but all of it faded quickly. After a few minutes, the stronger scent always took over again. The worst was when a man brought something unusual. Some arrived reeking of garlic and onions. Others stank of mouldy clothes. Once in a while, someone would come with a strange chemical smell of tar or ash, and it would cling to the girl's hair for days. The scent got into the bedding, into the curtains, into the walls themselves. Some women became allergic to it all. Their skin broke out in red patches, their necks itched, and their armpits flared up with rashes. They sneezed constantly or had swollen eyes. But none of that mattered. They still had to work. There were no excuses for sensitivity. If a girl couldn't handle the smell, she was considered weak. It's like working in a factory where you have to wear every product you help produce, no matter how toxic it is. The air inside the brothel never cleared. There were no windows large enough to let in real wind. Candles burned low, and the heat kept the smell pressed down like a blanket. Opening the door brought a moment of relief, but it also let in flies, so the door stayed closed and the odor became part of the building. They washed what they could, but it was never enough. Their dresses were reused, often still damp from the night before. If a man had left a strong scent, the dress carried it into the next shift, and if a girl tried to borrow or hide a cleaner one, she was accused of stealing. Most girls accepted it. After a few weeks, their noses stopped noticing. They became used to their own sour smell, to the sweat of strangers drying on their skin, to the perfume of a man who had died weeks ago but still haunted the bedding. It was easier to stop caring. Some clients even liked it. They said it made the women feel real, like they had been used. A girl who smelled too fresh was sometimes treated with suspicion, like she hadn't worked enough or wasn't willing enough. So the scent of others became a kind of proof, a grim badge of experience. The women didn't talk about it much. They sniffed their sleeves in silence. They rubbed their arms when they itched. Sometimes, if the scent made them gag, they turned their head and took shallow breaths, but they didn't ask for time off or special treatment. There was no point. What I find most unsettling is how the very thing that made them feel ill was also what kept them employed. They learned tricks, breathing through the mouth, smearing a bit of ash under the nose, holding a cloth between the lips during work. None of it worked for long, but it made them feel like they were doing something, like they had some control. Once in a while, someone would get desperate. A girl would wash her hair in the rain or rub vinegar on her skin. If she had a little money, she might buy dried herbs to stuff into her bodice. But if anyone saw her doing this too often, they'd say she was wasting resources or trying to be better than the others. So the women lived with it. Every scent, every rash, every sting. They layered new smells on top of old ones, and they stopped flinching when someone reeked. They swallowed the nausea, wiped their faces, and waited for the next man. The idea of smelling like yourself, of having your own scent and nothing else, was something they lost early after enough weeks. Most forgot what they smelled like before the work began. The perfume of innocence didn't last long in places like that. In the next part, we'll move from smell to skin, to the quiet injuries that built up where no one could see. The scars between the legs, the constant friction, and how the pain was never a reason to stop. Fresh sheets didn't mean the bed was clean. In the brothel, a new sheet was one that hadn't picked up too much odor, not one that had been washed most of the time. The same piece of cloth was turned over or aired out for a minute before being laid down again. The stains were still there. So were the folds from bodies that had pressed into the same spot hour after hour. The wooden frames underneath groaned from constant use. Some were cracked at the edges or had splinters sticking out, but no one dared complain under the beds. It wasn't unusual to find dry blood, old pieces of cloth, or even insects making a home in the shadows. Cockroaches skittered away when someone lifted the sheet, and fleas bit at ankles during the night. There were no proper mattresses, just piles of straw, sometimes wrapped in coarse fabric, sometimes left bare. Over time, the straw flattened into a hard, uneven surface. It poked through the cloth and scratched the skin. In the damp seasons, it smelled of mold. In the dry months, it crumbled and left behind dust. It was like lying down in a forgotten barn, but one where every inch had a story you'd rather not know. Sometimes the girls tried to clean it themselves. They shook out the straw or swept the frame, but it made little difference. One girl wiped the wood with vinegar once and got scolded for wasting it. They were told the bed was good enough as long as no one complained. But clients rarely cared about cleanliness. They were too focused on other things. If a girl was lucky, she might get a new cloth to lay over the bedding every few days. But new didn't mean sterile. It meant that the cloth didn't yet have holes or hadn't turned stiff from dried fluids. A few women brought their own clothes and hid them between shifts. But if caught, they were punished for being selfish. Lice were common. They crawled out of the seams and into the women's clothes. Some girls shaved their heads just to keep them away. Others scratched at their scalps until the skin bled. Flea bites dotted their legs and arms, especially near the joints. At night, some wrapped their limbs in rags to stop themselves from itching in their sleep. They learned not to sleep too deeply. A sudden movement could drive a splinter into the hip or a flea into the underwear. Girls woke up with red welts, sometimes crusted with pus. They would dab at them with old cloth or ashes, but it only dulled the pain for a short while. In modern hotels, guests leave bad reviews for stains on pillows. These girls lay their heads on blood and mold and called it a night. Some women tried to soften the bedding. They stuffed it with leaves or grass or folded extra clothing to cushion their backs, but it never lasted. A few clients even complained that the bed was too soft or smelled wrong. So the extra padding was thrown out back to bare wooden straw again. Infections spread fast. Girls with open wounds were especially at risk. Even tiny cuts became dangerous when pressed into damp, reused cloth, but they weren't allowed to rest. If one girl was out sick, another had to take her place, sometimes using the same bed without even changing the sheet. If someone fell ill, the only help they got was a handful of lime powder or some salt. They were told to rub it into the bites or sores. It stung badly, but there were no other options. A few had homemade remedies, dried herbs mixed with oil, but those ran out quickly. Most learned to endure. The smell of the beds was something no one could fully escape. After a while, even the women's clothes carried it. It soaked into their skin, into their hair, into the fabric they wore when they stepped outside. A visitor could tell where a girl worked just by walking past her in the street. The brothel owners didn't see the point in maintaining the beds. They said it was just a place to lie down, not a palace. One man joked that the bugs made things more lively. No one laughed. What stays with me most is not the filth, but how normal it became. Once something disgusting becomes routine, people stop noticing. Some try to mark the cleaner beds as their own, claiming them early in the day, or bribing others to stay away. But nothing stayed clean for long. Every shift brought someone new. By evening, even the best corner in the house felt the same as the worst. In cold weather, the dampness turned to chill. The girls huddled under thin cloths that did little to warm them. Some burned small scraps of wood in the makeshift stoves, but smoke filled the room and clung to the walls. They coughed more in winter, and the beds grew mouldy from condensation. A few girls whispered about places in bigger cities where the beds were actually washed, where the rooms had proper floors and windows, but most knew they'd never go there. Their reality was splinters, straw, and cloth that was never truly clean. They learned to rest with one eye open. Sleep was a necessity, not a comfort. When the work was done, they curled up in the same spot, wiped their arms with whatever they had left, and waited for the next knock on the door. Next, we'll move from where they slept to how they dealt with their own blood. Not monthly cycles, but the stains left behind after work, the smell of old wounds, and the ways the body left its marks night after night. There was no escape from the smell. The communal spaces in medieval brothels were not designed for comfort or hygiene. Each room served too many purposes, and none of them had to do with cleanliness. The air hung heavy with a mixture of bodily odour, old rags, spilled fluids, and unwashed corners. Around the sleeping area there were no designated bins, no effort to separate waste from rest. A chamber pot often stood close to the bed, sometimes half full, sometimes already tipped over, left for the next shift to clean up, which rarely happened. Used cloths and medical waste, if they could be called that, were thrown around the legs of the beds. Strips of stained linen, broken herbs once used to mask smells, and pieces of hardened soap that were never used again, all gathered in small piles. Nobody picked them up unless absolutely necessary. The concept of rotating cleaning duty or designated cleaners did not exist. If someone was too disgusted, they just moved to another corner. But no corner didn't smell like something had died there recently. It's hard to imagine people paying for affection while sitting next to a used chamber pot. But that was just another normal detail in their day. The blankets, if they were even used, were barely distinguishable from floor rags. Most were reused across days and bodies. There was no point in washing them daily, and even if someone tried, drying them in the limited sunlight of alleyways took too long. Compared to today's standards, where people change sheets after one bad night's sleep, these women slept on what would now be labelled biohazardous material. But back then, that was still considered a working bed. There were no scents to cover anything up effectively. A bottle of scented oil might pass from one girl to another, but it barely lasted a few minutes in the thick air. The stronger the stench, the more someone tried to overcompensate with cheap, overly sweet oils, which only made the smell more confusing. The mixture of rotting cloth and overused rose water became its signature odour. In the evening, the heat from lamps and the crush of warm bodies made the room's staleness rise and linger near the ceiling like steam that never cleared. The wooden floor soaked up everything. Blood, urine, spilled wine, old soup, melted wax, and everything else that hit the ground left a mark. Most stains were rubbed into the grain of the wood rather than wiped away. There were no mops, no regular buckets of clean water. If anything was done, it was usually a splash of ash mixed with water, then pushed around with a foot or a cloth. No effort to truly sanitize anything. Most of the girls ignored it, not because they liked it, but because they had no time or energy to care. Many worked until their legs could barely hold them up, then fell asleep in the same place they had served clients. No one had time to tidy up the space before or after. There were no shifts for cleaning, no tools for it, and no designated supplies. Even asking for something to wipe the floor might get someone scolded for wasting time. So the waste piled up quietly. A piece of used cloth near one bed might sit there for days before someone accidentally steps on it. From a modern perspective, the idea of a workplace like this is absurd, even illegal. But in medieval brothels, it was not questioned. The filth, the smell, and the lack of order was simply considered part of the atmosphere. If anyone dared to complain, they would be reminded that they were not hired for their preferences. Even clients rarely mentioned the mess. Either they expected it or were too drunk to notice. Some women learned how to block it out mentally. They developed the ability to ignore smells, to step over waste, and to rest with one eye open, avoiding the worst of the filth. But their bodies still responded. Skin infections were common. Sores appeared on the legs, especially where sheets and skin met for too long without air. Rashes from shared linens were accepted as normal. Bites from fleas or other pests were constant. There was never a schedule. No day of the week is when the place would be cleared, scrubbed, or reorganized. If a girl got sick, they blamed her for being too weak, not the filth around her. If a client complained, the blame went to the nearest worker, not the system that failed to maintain basic cleanliness. There was no ownership of the environment, no tools for maintaining it, and no reason to hope it would improve. The atmosphere stayed as it was until something forced a change, like illness or death. Nobody talked about it openly. The smell, the waste, the mess. It was acknowledged silently, but rarely discussed. Everyone shared the same reality, but kept their discomfort buried. The worst thing one could do was appear too bothered. Looking disgusted was seen as unprofessional. Showing discomfort could cost a worker her spot or her clients. Every brothel had its own version of this neglect. Some were worse than others. A lucky few might have a matron who insisted on wiping down surfaces, but those were rare exceptions. The majority followed the same rule. As long as the work continued, nothing needed to change. And so the space stayed filled with overlapping smells and forgotten waste, blending into the skin of every person who entered. It's strange to think how used people became to sleeping next to waste. But it becomes easier to understand when you realize they didn't have the luxury of noticing anymore. What smelled like horror to an outsider was simply the background noise of their survival. Next, we'll go further into the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, cleanliness could lead to freedom. There was a time when some of them believed that cleanliness could buy them a different life. The idea floated around like a rumor that never quite disappeared. Girls would whisper to each other, saying that if they learned to stay fresh, if they could make themselves smell like flowers or keep their hair soft and neat, someone might see them differently. Not just as a body for rent, but as someone worth keeping. It sounded naive, but hope had a strange way of surviving in even the darkest corners. Some of them began collecting bits of scented herbs, stealing drops of perfume when no one was watching. They practiced washing their hair more regularly when they had water to spare, even if it meant going without a meal. They folded their garments carefully, tucked dried rose petals in their pockets, and tried to memorize how noble women held themselves. They even tried speaking more gently, watching how visiting ladies behaved when they passed the brothel windows. Cleanliness for them wasn't just about hygiene, it was a rehearsal. A few believed they were close to escaping. There were stories of girls who had caught the eye of a rich merchant or a widower, were taken away and never returned. Most of those tales weren't true, but they were repeated often enough to feel real. And in those stories, it was always the cleanest, neatest girls who were chosen. Never the ones with broken teeth or messy hair. So some tried. They scrubbed harder, spoke less, and waited. It's oddly similar to how people today think changing their appearance can change their fate, even when the system stays the same. What they often didn't realize was that the men who took them away weren't offering a new life. They were simply relocating the same misery. A girl who had caught someone's eye might be bought out of the brothel, but she was rarely taken in as a wife. More often, she became a servant in a private house or a mistress locked in a side room. She was still paid for in coin. The setting changed, but the status did not. Even so, many preferred that to the brothel. At least there were fewer clients. Sometimes there was better food or a cleaner bed. But it came at a cost. Freedom wasn't part of the bargain. She had to behave exactly as expected. If she failed to meet the new master's standards, she could be cast out again. And once cast out, she could rarely return to the brothel. She had already been replaced. Still, the hope remained for others. Watching those girls disappear, even without knowing the truth of their destination, gave them a goal to reach for. Some even tried to learn to write or sew, skills they thought might make them more appealing. If a man came in and showed kindness, they would offer their best manners. They tried not to cough or limp. They tucked their hair back properly and smiled gently, not because they wanted more work, but because they wanted out. I think the saddest part is that they cleaned themselves not for health, but for the slim chance of being wanted. But over time, most learned that being clean didn't mean being respected. Their efforts were usually ignored or treated as a curiosity. A man might remark that a girl smelled nice, but it didn't change what he expected from her. He wasn't there to rescue her. He was there to forget himself for a while, and she was part of that forgetting. The cleanliness she had worked so hard for became part of the illusion, not the escape. The older ones warned the new girls. They said not to waste oil, not to use up the good herbs. They said if someone was going to like you, it would happen whether you washed or not. But few listened. They had to try it for themselves. They had to believe there was a different way out, that maybe their path wasn't already written. Sometimes a man would take one away. She'd leave with a small bundle of clothes and a stiff smile, looking back at the others with a mixture of pride and fear. And for a little while, those left behind would clean more, hoping they would be next. But days would pass, then weeks, and if they ever heard about her again, it was never a happy ending. Cleanliness became something quiet, less about hope and more about habit. Some girls still rinsed their faces before sleep, even if the water was cold and scarce. They brushed their hair with broken combs and tied ribbons around their wrists, not because they thought it would change their lives, but because it made them feel less forgotten. Even if no one noticed, they noticed. It helped them hold on. The smell of soap was rare, but it lingered in corners when someone tried. A trace of rosemary on a pillow, a faint scent of lavender under a collar. These were signs that someone still cared about themselves. They were small acts of defiance. The brothel didn't reward such things, but it didn't forbid them either. As long as it didn't waste money or offend a customer, it was tolerated. And in those moments, under the flickering light of a shared candle, a girl could imagine herself somewhere else, somewhere quieter, cleaner, safer, even if it was just in her mind. Cleanliness didn't buy her freedom, but it gave her a way to endure what came next. It's strange how the smallest rituals can feel like resistance when everything else is out of your hands. They didn't talk about it much anymore. The dream of being chosen had faded for most, but now and then, someone would hum a tune while rinsing her hair, or smile faintly while scrubbing her hands. The dream wasn't completely gone. It was just folded away, like a clean cloth kept for a special occasion that might never come. The truth was, being clean never saved them, but it made them feel human, if only for a few minutes. And sometimes that was enough to get through one more day. Soon, we'll step into the quiet routine that followed those hopes, for exhaustion replaced ambition, and only survival remained. When a prostitute in the Middle Ages died, the process was silent. There was no ceremony, no priest, no final words, just the removal of another body that no longer brought in coins. Most of the time, the other women kept working. They might glance over briefly, but no one was allowed to pause too long. The body would be wrapped in whatever was nearby, usually a cloth already soiled and dragged out before dawn. The place had to be ready for the next day. Customers were expected, and death didn't stop business. The most noticeable thing about the body was the smell. Even in death, the scent of the last customer remained. Sweat, oil, alcohol, and something sour clung to the skin. There was no final bath. No one wiped her face clean or combed her hair. Sometimes there wasn't even time to close the eyes. The smell lingered the longest, that and the stains. Her clothing was never changed. Whatever she wore during her last moments was left on her. Torn fabric sticky from dried fluids might hang awkwardly. The cloth used to wrap her body was never fresh. It was whatever the brothel had, and nothing was saved for death. The women knew this. They didn't expect anything different. Some were buried just outside the brothel near the back in shallow holes. Others were taken to common pits for the poor, where their bodies mixed with strangers. No headstone, no name. No one marked the grave. If someone asked who she was, the answer was simple. She was one of the girls. No one needed to know more than that. There were no prayers said. No one lit candles. Sometimes the women would whisper among themselves, especially if the one who died was young or had been kind. But the whispers faded quickly. The next night would come, and the beds had to be filled again. New girls would take the place of the old. Customers would forget. The death itself was often slow. Fever, infection, and injuries that never healed. Other times, it was sudden. A beating, an illness that struck in the night. Either way, there was never a doctor, never a healer. The women took care of each other with what they had. A rag, some warm water, a word of comfort if they dared. But mostly, they died quietly because loud deaths disturbed the work. The room where she died might still carry her scent for days. It was a mix of unwashed bodies, cheap oil, and decay. If a new girl were placed in that room, she might scrub the floor, hoping to make it smell better. But nothing ever smelled clean in a place like that. Even the scent of death didn't seem very different from the scent of life there. Some women feared this end, but most accepted it. They knew it would come sooner or later. They didn't speak of it often. It was too close, too common. But they noticed when a girl's skin turned pale, when her steps grew slower, when she winced every time she sat. They watched and they knew. There was no plan for what came after. No letters sent, no belongings passed on. Most had nothing worth keeping. A comb, a scarf, a small tin of salve. The others might take these, not out of disrespect, but out of need. Even in death, a woman could offer something to the living, even if it was just a half-used hairpin. Sometimes a girl tried to prepare for death. She might hide a clean cloth, hoping to wrap herself in it if the time came. Or she might whisper a prayer at night asking to be remembered. But nothing lasted. If someone asked about her later, they would hear only that she died like many others and was taken away. The worst part for many was knowing that their bodies would still carry the smell of strangers even after death. The scent that never left them in life would follow them to the grave. In modern times, people get a final wash, a fresh garment, even when they're poor. But these women didn't. They left the world the same way they lived in it, unclean in the eyes of others, forgotten by the world and smelling like someone else. There was no record of their passing, no ledger with their names, no family came to claim them. Even the brothel owner barely noticed. As long as there were enough women to fill the rooms, one more or one less didn't matter. Still, the others remembered in small ways. They would glance at the empty spot where she used to sleep. They might touch her comb left behind on a ledge or think of her when someone laughed the way she used to. These weren't big gestures, but they were real. Some said the dead never really left. that their presence lingered in the walls, in the corners of the rooms, that their breath could be felt in the cold drafts that came at night. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. It gave the women something to hold on to, a way to believe they weren't completely alone. When one of the older women died, there was sometimes a pause, not a ceremony, just a stillness. A few would look down, hold their breath, and think of how long she had survived. Then life would go on. It had to. The smell that clung to the walls never left. Some said it was the building itself. Others said it was the memory of the women. Either way, it became part of the place, just like the creaking floorboards and the stained mattresses. By the time the last girl who remembered her also disappeared, no one spoke her name, but a new girl might walk in, wrinkle her nose, and ask what that smell was. And someone older might just say, "Someone used to sleep there." And that was the final truth. No matter how hard they tried to stay clean, no matter how many times they washed or hid the stench with herbs, the world still saw them the same. They were never clean enough, never worthy enough. Even in death, they were not given the dignity others received. I sometimes think the only difference between a proper burial and theirs was the direction the body faced. Tonight, as you let the quiet settle in and sleep take over, remember that some lives never had the chance to be honored. Let your rest be a moment of stillness,